Father, we thank you for this class, Lord, and this day. And Lord, I pray that as we continue our survey of the Old Testament, Lord, that you help bring it alive to us, that it be more than just a story. It will be the life that you present to us, Lord, and that through that we'll see that it's an example for us. And we'll see your purpose and your meaning in all aspects of it. And we thank you for that. In your name we pray. Amen. All right. We saw how the Old Testament was divided up in the Bible, the way it was laid out in the Bible, and that after, and I can't remember if I misspoke last week, but after Esther, I may have said after Ruth, but after Esther, all of the books in the Bible fit back into the previous 17. So I thought on my notes I had down Ruth instead of Esther, but so what I want us to look at today is the literature. The literature of the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. And what I want for you to take from this is that by recognizing that these just aren't random stories, that these have purpose and meaning, and that God in his wisdom has presented all of this information in the Old Testament through inspired writings to enrich us and also to show us his plan. And there's 5 categories of literature, if you will, that he gives us in the Old Testament. And we're going to look at these individually, but I'll give them to you to get us started. Narratives. That would be the first category. And the second would be the law. And there is some overlapping in these. Some of the, like the law, the book Exodus covers the law, but there's also some narrative in that. And we'll explain it so you get a good picture of it. Prophecy. Psalms. And then the last category would be wisdom. I know I can write that better than that. You know how hard it is for a left-hand person to write on the board. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so each one of these could be put in a category of a type of literature. And what I want us to do is to look at these. Tonight we'll probably just do the narratives and see what makes up a narrative. But I want to give you all 5. And then as we go through and you do any studies or you listen to a sermon or read a book or an article or something, you will begin to recognize these as types or literature that is the Bible. Again, I'll say it many times, the Old Testament is just not stories. There's a purpose and a reason for all that's in there, and they are broken up this way. It'd be easy to say, well, God wrote them, and then we went and put these labels on them. So that's kind of working backwards. But God presented them this way because each one of these has a function, and he wants us to see that function. Sometimes we may see the function subconsciously. We may not outwardly know, oh yeah, that's a narrative, and I know what a narrative is. But we read it, and it's presented in such a way that we're able to draw from that more so than if it wasn't structured in this way. Or the wisdom literature, the way it is presented, we are able to recognize, okay, these are do's and don'ts, because the wise person follows them and ends up doing godly things. And the Psalms, I'm not going to go through them now, but let's look at the narrative. So knowing the type of literature and what type is what it's intended to say or show will help you understand God's purpose for writing. So giving you additional understanding of the Old Testament. So now when you read Genesis, that's one of our examples of a narrative. when you read Genesis, you will know that he is presenting a story with many characters in it. To me, it just puts a greater awareness of what you're reading. You're not just reading to read. And understand me on this part. I don't have a problem with reading the Bible through. You know, there's so many programs out there. Read the Bible through in a year. And that's a good thing. But the objective is to get to the end. The objective is not to learn along the way. Because, you know, if you have a goal, and being a man, and we're very goal-oriented, we see a project, we want to see it done. We don't want all the in-between. What I need to do to get it done. That's why we don't follow instructions very well. We get a box, and we see something, a shelving we got to put together. We put it together, and if everything else fails, then we get out the instructions. So, you know, we're goal-oriented in that way. I remember putting a dollhouse together for my girls one Christmas. And I just wanted to get it done because I wanted to go to bed. And when I was finished, there was one wall that was the living room wall with opening doors to a patio was on the second floor. And it was one of those Barbie houses. And I was not taking it back apart. I said, they'll never notice. First thing, the oldest one looks and she says, Dad, somebody put the living room wall upstairs. But anyway, knowing that this is a narrative, knowing that there's certain properties and things that are brought out to you, you will be able to draw more meaning and understanding from the scriptures. So it may seem like an exercise in just a lot of words, but I think anything that we do that brings a better understanding of why it was written and what it's saying will enhance our understanding. Okay, so our first one, everybody got all 5 of them? Okay. Our first one, a narrative. In one word, they're stories. They're purposeful stories, retelling the historical events of the past that are intended to give meaning and direction for a given people in the present. Remember the passage we read last week? It was 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And it's talking about the nation of Israel and to avoid their mistakes. In one part of the passage, he's talking about, I don't want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers who were under the cloud and passed through, it talks about them being like a baptism for them, but that they didn't listen to God, and they did the things that they shouldn't have done. And he says, now these things, this is verse 11, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11, he said, now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. So God, in his wisdom in writing these narratives and these stories, he knows, and Paul brings it out here in Corinthians, that these were written for our instruction. How does he say it? These happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instructions, upon whom the end of the ages. Therefore let him who thinks that he stands, lest he fall. And twice he uses this term that in verse 6 he says, now these things happen as examples for us, that we should not crave evil things as they also crave. That's something that we're going to look at as we get through in the narratives, but since we're there, always as you're reading, always look for repeated phrases. Like if you're reading this passage in 1 Corinthians 10, in verse 6 he says, these things happened as an example for us, that we should not crave the evil things as they also crave. And then you go down to verse 11, he says, now these things happened to them as an example, that they were written for our instruction. So as you read, that's why I would say reading through the Bible in a year, it's a good goal. But it eliminates the possibility of you spending a little bit of time and seeing, hey, he said that 3 verses before. Or if you look in Romans, there are places where Paul uses the term, may it never be. He uses it at least 3 times in chapter 6. So he's emphasizing, may it never be. along with the other things that he's teaching in that. So look for repetition and repeated things. That will help you get through these. So let's see what a narrative. I have 5 things, I think I listed 5 things that comprise a narrative. Yes. First thing when you go about reading a narrative, and let me give you a quick, and I'll give these to you later. I may even send them to you so you don't have to write all these down. I thought I had them all written down here. Yeah. And the narrative, and you can write these or I'll send them to you. Narrative, these are stories telling historical events. Genesis, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, both Samuels, both Kings, both Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Daniel. Those are all in the form of narratives. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Daniel. Now, there are other books that have some narrative to them. Like I said, even Exodus, which is a book of the law, it also has some narrative in it, and we're going to look at that one. You get all those? Genesis, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuels, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and David. All right, Daniel. Okay, so as you're looking at these narratives, the first thing you want to know is, and this seems kind of obvious, who's the narrator? Who is this writing this book? Because knowing the author will help you have some insight into what he's saying. If you know it's Moses, and sometimes it's easy to tell that. Other times you might have to do a little research. If you have a study Bible, usually at the beginning of every book, it will give you a little history. It will give you the approximate time it was written, who the author was, what was his purpose, and it'll even give you an outline of the book, which is a good source for material. But knowing who wrote it and who's speaking this story, because oftentimes in the narration, his name won't be mentioned. They very seldom do first person or I went here or whatever. It's always a narration of what took place.
Or like a letter style.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And you'll notice as you start to read some, and you say, I know Moses wrote this. So then in your mind, you begin to picture Moses. You know the historical account of him in Genesis, and you know the historical account in Exodus and so forth, in Deuteronomy. Then you begin to put in your mind, oh, I know who this is. And, oh, I know why he said that. I remember how he was born and what happened to him during his birth and how he was saved that way. So those all are things that will help you know that. Okay, the second thing you want to look for, and this, it may not be too difficult, but sometimes you can skim past it. The scenes. Now the scenes, I'm not talking about a picture scene, but like a theater, act 1, act 2, scene 3, that type of thing. That there'll be a place in that narrative where he describes a particular event. He presents that scene, and each one of these scenes has its own integrity. That it's a conclusion to a degree within itself. Like you watch a play, at the end of Act 1 or Scene 2, you're prepared for the next scene because it's built from that first one. So as you read the narratives, remember that there's going to be a storyline, and then it may come to a conclusion, that particular part of the story, or, like a person. You read about Judah and Tamar and how he went away from his family. He found this wife who was not Jewish or Israelite, married her, and that scene is plugged in right in the middle of the story of Joseph. But there was a purpose in that. It was a part of that scene but it was separate in itself. It had a complete story. And the eventuality from that is the child that he had as a result of his affair, or if you would call it, with his daughter-in-law. Tamar was his daughter-in-law. He didn't know it. The son was Perez, and Perez was the descendant of David. So through that scene, you're able to pick up some of the lineage of David, even though it was through a, I don't know what you would call it, incestuous relationship. He didn't know it was his daughter-in-law. She dressed up differently to disguise him because he had promised her a son. But anyway, that would be a scene that you would find in the book of Genesis that would contribute to the overall story. In this case, the overall story of Joseph, because it's plugged right in the middle of that. Another part of a scene would be when Joseph comes to Jacob and he tells on his brothers that they were out there horsing around, not doing what they were supposed to do, taking care of the sheep. Then he has a dream, and he tells the dream to his brothers. He has another dream, and he tells it to his brothers again, and then he tells it to his brothers and his father. So that in itself is a scene which prepare you for what happened to Joseph when he went out in the wilderness and found them. They threw him in a pit and eventually sold him to the Ishmaelites. So those all would be scenes as you're reading, and if you go too quickly, you'll miss some of the story. Why would his brothers be so angry with him? If you didn't have those scenes and you jumped right to them wanting to kill him and throw him in a pit, and then eventually selling him to the Ishmaelites, you would have no clue why they would do that. So God built that along with the story. And they plot against him. So the third is the characters. Now on the characters, we'll spend just a little bit of time on those because I think it's very important to understand about the characters. So in the characters, in most cases, you're going to find God, an enemy, and then the other. Then you're going to find the other characters. And each of these stories, as you go through this narrative, maybe in a particular scene, you may not see these labeled just as they are, but they're there. God's going to be there in every scene. He's going to be there in every story, even though his name's not mentioned. You know he's there in the background if it is. And there'll be someone who's trying to fool the scene. What kind of movie or show would it be that you would watch if there wasn't a good guy, a bad guy, and supporting cast? So as you're reading this narrative, you're going to start to be able to pick out the characters, and you know which ones are working for the good or working for God. You're going to see who's trying to destroy that plan, and then who are the supporting characters. And these supporting characters, sometimes they're hard to recognize as a character because their time in the story is so brief. We say, why did he put that guy in there? He didn't do anything, but there was an element of it. And the enemy, when I say enemy, who would you think? Who would you think I'm talking about? Who?
Evil.
Evil, which would include Satan. Pharaoh, yeah. It could be anyone who, in some way, one of two things, he's either coming against God's plan, or what could be another way that...
Standing in his way, trying to defeat it.
Yes.
Or deceiving.
Right. He'd be someone who would be trying to deceive or to break God's plan. How about someone that God puts in the picture to correct the nation of Israel? Nebuchadnezzar. Some of the kings from Assyria, Babylon, they come down, and their character role was as enemy, but they, in a sense, were sent by God to punish Israel for their disobedience and their worship of other idols. So the enemy, I guess you would know that Nebuchadnezzar is an enemy of Israel. But remember, he was an enemy of Israel because God was wanting to punish them for their bad deeds. So he wasn't necessarily Satan, but he had a part in the plan. And then the other characters, if you go beyond God and you go beyond the recognized antagonist would be the word you would want to use. If you go beyond that, then other characters, they can be main characters, Abraham, David, Joseph, and then sometimes there'll be lesser characters, people that maybe they only have a short stint, maybe a couple of verses, but their involvement is important for the overall narrative. Each one has its role to play, maybe brief, but it has their function. Now, you guys got all that? Okay. Maybe I'll improve my writing skills. Or not. Okay, under the characters, there's some smaller categories. They're the ones that are chosen. They're chosen to perform a function. They're not there just because God wanted to fill up the pages. They're not there because they were the smartest guy in the country at that time and he wanted to display them or whatever it would be. They all had a reason for being there. They were chosen, had an important function. And don't dismiss them because their portion in the story is very small. Remember, the Old Testament book covers thousands of years, a couple thousand years or more. So if anybody is in that story, when you go back and you look at the average history book and so forth, if someone makes it in the history book, they had a contribution that they played. So when we see the lesser knowns, if you will, in the narrative, that they have a function, and what it will do, it will challenge us to look a little closer and see why are they there, and not just read past them. That does two things. One, it gives you a greater understanding of why they're there, but it also trains your brain. What we were talking about earlier, your memory and so forth, it trains your brain to recognize those things quickly. When you get to doing more reading and more study of the Word and breaking it down into different themes and so forth, you'll find as you read, those things kind of pop out at you. You will see them. Like he said, it was written for our example and instruction. He does that twice. That jumps out at you. So the more you train your brain to do those things. So when we see what we think is an insignificant character, see if it talks about him anyplace else. It could be that's the only place that he's mentioned, but he may show up someplace else. And the other thing, and I know I'm almost going against what I just said, but when you look for that less significant person, don't feel that you're always going to have the answer why he's there. God leaves a lot blank. He doesn't fill in all the blanks. At some point, we'll be understanding all of it, but until then, just recognize, okay, God had a purpose for him there. I may not understand it now, but I'm going to retain that, and I'm going to consider that from time to time, and you'll be surprised that you're reading something later and you say, oh, that's why that guy was in that story. And that will be part of the things that will help you enlighten. Okay? The other thing that we have to recognize about the character their description. What does it say about this person? If I mention John the Baptist, and I know we're doing Old Testament, but if I say John the Baptist, what do you think of? Besides him baptizing in water, if I said, describe to me John the Baptist. Yeah. Yeah, so the description that the Bible gives us about him helps us visualize him, and it also would say something about his character. How many would go out and it looks as if from some historical accounts, he stayed out in the wilderness for a long time. Maybe from the time he was bar mitzvah, 13 or so, that he spent a lot of time out in the wilderness. So that's why he dressed the way he did, and that's why he ate the locusts and honey. And that, recognizing that, gives you a better understanding of this John, that why he would say some of the harsh things he said. You brood of vipers, why are you coming out here? You know, show the fruit of your repentance. You know, he wasn't easy, maybe like a Donald Trump. You know, he just throws out there what he's got to say. So look for descriptions, because oftentimes the characters doesn't say anything about him other than, and so come in the scene and he did this and he was gone. You don't have any picture in your mind. What's this guy look like? Or what's this lady look like? So when they do give you a description, take that and consider that, because there's an important aspect as to why they gave you a description. If they don't give you a description, then his appearance isn't important. But when you think about John the Baptist, that description that they give of him has to do with his character and his nature.